Hello and welcome to the top Hearthstone cards of the week, where we look at the top cards from the r/customhearthstone subreddit. I'm your host, Snooky, and first up we have Frankenrat. 2 mana 2/2 beast for the hunter with Death Rattle. If it's your opponent's turn, they craft a custom zombeast for you. Knights of the Frozen Throne introduced a few type of Death Rattle cards with the if it's your opponent's turn requirement, and I think this type of Death Rattle has a unique board presence that changes how both players interact with the board. In my opinion, Scalemancer is the best version out there right now. The 2/2 stat line allows you to apply some pressure with 2 attack, but the low health also discourages your opponent from using any board clears. In addition, summoning an 8/8 is a much greater immediate threat than summoning a 2/2 or gaining some armor, so your opponent will actually try to play around it. In total, the card can get you 10/10 stats for 5 mana, and I think that's the perfect ratio for cards like these. Now Frankenrat is a little different. It's trying to get you value, but not necessarily an immediate board threat. Of course, the coolest part about this card is that your opponent, after killing the minion, will now have to try to make the worst possible beast for you, and that's a really fun mechanic. With this said, I don't think crafting you a beast has the same discouraging effect as summoning an 8/8 skeleton like Scalemancer does. If you've ever played Scalemancer, there's something about playing it on turn 5 and then taunting it turn 6, and then by turn 8 your opponent finally gives in and kills it. It's very rewarding to have your opponent play around a 2/2 and then be able to summon an 8/8. But with Frankenrat, I don't think people will care too much about killing this card off because there's no immediate threat. I thought maybe you could increase the cost to 3 or 4 and make it summon the zombeast for you, but I feel like losing the zombeast battlecry effect kinda hurts the purpose of the card. It's a great card for sure. I don't know if it would see play because of the competitive 2-drop category for Hunter, but if you know of a way that could make your opponent try to play around this card more, I think it would make the card even more enjoyable to play. Next up is Chaos Theory. 10 mana warlock spell, cast a random spell. If there are still minions in the battlefield, cast this again. So this card is a lot like Yogg, which means it's pretty tough to evaluate whether it's balanced or not because it's so random. First big difference is Chaos Theory is an epic, so you could run 2 in your deck. Is this balanced? I honestly don't know. Another pretty big factor is that Yogg's power is determined by the number of spells you cast before you play the card, and this card doesn't really rely on your deck being filled with spells in order to make it good. Now, spells are just powerful cards to play, so most decks will have them anyways, but while it's not often really noticeable, Yoggs that somehow get into your hand, maybe off of Discover, without a good number of spells being played before it, suffer in performance. But I suppose the most distinctive feature of this card is that it relies on the board's state. More minions on the board equals more opportunities for spells. 10 mana Doom already exists, and this is the meme version of that. I could definitely see Chaos Theory being a problem when Commanding Shout is cast early, and then there are only a few spells that could actually clear your minions. There would be a lot of problems having this in Hearthstone in terms of competitiveness and having turns take a long time, but Yogg causes these problems too. Do you really want your opponent to be able to play 3 Yoggs in a game? Well, if you want, you can check out the video where I did it here. That's some nice cross promotion. I think to ensure there isn't some crazy combination of spells that end up actually breaking the game and crashing Blizzard's servers, I would have it cast the spells until the board is either clear or the timer runs out, just in case. Thinking back on my Yoggs, most often there are still minions on the board, even with 10 or so spells being cast, so I don't really know if the board would be cleared before one of the players died or drew their entire deck. You can watch highlights of Yogg, you can play 100 games with Yogg, but you'll never really know what you're going to get out of it, and that's why it's so special. And maybe even though I like this card's take on Yogg, incorporating that board clear aspect, I wouldn't want to see it in Ladder, but in Tavern Brawl, hot mama. Next up we have Catchup, a hunter secret that reads when your opponent draws an additional card during their turn, draw 2 cards. So I've already given my spiel on the complexities of how secrets are weighted and valued, and this is a more specific point that will apply to this card and a later card as well. This secret is a 2 mana draw 2 cards, but the core mechanic of any secret depends on how your opponent will play around it. For example, a lot of opponents want to draw additional cards on their turn. Who doesn't? But you know what I can guarantee every opponent wants to do? They want to kill you. And that's why Ice Block is so good. It prevents your opponent from winning the game, unless fatigue, of course. Maybe that's a bad example because the card is really powerful, but if you look back at Catchup, drawing 2 cards isn't often going to happen right away because your opponent isn't going to draw an additional card every turn. I would imagine against most decks, you play this, and in the next 5 turns or so, you'll probably get to draw 2 cards. But that's why I actually think it's a pretty weak card. Yes, Hunter needs all the draw they can get, and this would be great against decks trying to draw their combo, but I don't think paying that mana and putting in a card or 2 card slots in your deck on no guarantee that you'll draw the card isn't that great. I would much prefer the 3 mana draw 2 cards because that's guaranteed, even though it's a little bit more expensive. Now of course, if there was a secret hunter, this would see play, but that applies to any hunter secret I talk about. I like the flavor of the card because as a class, hunter is truly always trying to catch up and draw. I think the creator had the right mindset in trying to create a card that would give hunter that tiny nudge of draw they need to make a more viable control deck without it working in aggro hunter, which would be too strong with some more draw. That's why we can't have a 3 mana draw 2 card for hunter, because any more draw for aggro would make it too powerful. I feel like there still could be a way to accomplish this draw for hunter, because right now the randomness of this card is still a little bit too weak for a more controlling hunter. We'll get there, boys. We'll get there. Next up we have Arcane Rager. 3 mana 5/1 mage card with the Battlecry, gain +1 health for each spell in your hand. First off, make this an elemental. Some Ragers aren't, others are. Make them all elementals because right now nobody loves them anyways, and I want to so bad. The Rager is all about a balanced statted minion with terrible distribution. 5 attack, 1 health, 1 attack, 5 health. They all generally suck. In Gadgetzan, Shadow Rager was an attempt, and while technically not part of the Rager family, Un'Goro's Tarkreeper is actually the same stats as Enigma Rager, but it's 100 times better with Taunt and the attack bonus on your opponent's turn. So they're making Ragers better, because they're disguising them. If you think about it, Aya Blackpaw is just a Rager with +2 health, and a Battlecry Death Rattle summoned green Rager. All Jades are actually Ragers. Now that I've leaked that conspiracy, I think Arcane Rager is a good card. Mage could use a good 3-drop minion, Death Knight Jaina makes Elemental Mage playable on ladder, and giving the player a way to improve a Rager's stats is also helpful. Best case scenario, with 9 other spells in hand, it's a 3 mana 5/10. I don't know if that's necessarily a viable deck, maybe some sort of freeze mage, but I think on average, if you played it on turn 3, you'd be able to get a 5/2 or a 5/3. Is that better than Tarkreeper? Definitely not, especially if you're trying to incorporate this in a Death Knight Elemental Mage deck, but is it a playable Rager? Maybe so. I'm a little bit scared of this in an aggro mage or a freeze mage, where if you do have like 5 spells in your hand on turn 3, it's a 3 mana 5/6, but most aggro decks can't really hold on to a big hand like that, and I kinda just like the idea of finally giving Ragers some sort of foothold so that people can actually play them. It's a good card, it has meme and competitive implications. And at number 1, we have Mirror Mockery. Mage secret that reads, when an enemy minion attacks, summon a copy of it as the new target. So this card is like a combination of Mirror Entity and Noble Sacrifice. Going back to my other secret discussion, your opponent will often want to attack with their minions, so for this secret, the effect is pretty often going to happen. Thus, the effect shouldn't be too strong for the mana. I think this card is perfectly balanced. This card can be played around by attacking with your cheap or injured minions, but it can also heavily punish your opponent if they don't play around it, because you can get a lot of value from it. The card takes into consideration the stats of your opponent's minion and the order in which they choose to attack. In most ways, it's better than Mirror Entity, because it effectively prevents damage from one of your opponent's minions attacking, and by observing your opponent's board, you can try to increase the power of the secret by trying to dictate which minion they attack with. And that's why I like this card better than Mirror Entity, because I feel like you have more control over what your opponent can attack with, as opposed to what they play. Great secret. I think it's powerful enough to work in a secret mage, and I think it would create a lot of memorable instances. And now we have this week's user submission from Sedather with Aggro Strong Stout. 4 mana 3/3 legendary with the Battlecry. Craft 2 weapons into a 3/3 weapon that costs 5. These weapons are not class specific, so you'll be choosing from all class weapons. This means you could get a Doom Hammer, Gladiator Bow, Gorehowl True Silver Champion, or Jade Claw Tentacles for arms. All 5 mana 3/3. Now these are of course really good and lucky pairings, but I do find it interesting that instead of just combining the stats and cost of the 2 weapons, you would instead just package the stats into the 5 mana 3/3. Because if you think about it, often it probably will just be that, a 5 mana 3/3 weapon with no other benefits. My biggest issue is just with Tentacles of Arms. Right now the card is 5 mana and it just sucks because it's a 2/2 weapon. But if you're able to make Tentacles for Arms with Doomhammer, Longbow, or Jade Claw, that's crazy late game. Now most of the time that won't happen, so I think this would be fine, because anytime you have a card that isn't that consistent, it doesn't become competitive and then people don't play it as much. But I do think this is a really cool way of incorporating weapons in a more control oriented way, and it's pretty unique. Thank you Sedather for this week's submission. Info is in the description if you want to send your card creations. I've been your host, thank you for watching, and until next time.